Good morning and welcome to this hour-long seminar on Biodiversity Net Gain, everything you wanted to know about BNG but were afraid to ask. Let me try and get the slides to move on. There we are. Okay. First of all, who am I? My name's Angus Walker. I am a partner at PITMANS. I specialise in infrastructure planning, although BNG, Biodiversity Net Gain, covers all planning, town and country planning, as well as infrastructure planning. Why am I delivering this talk and why should you be interested? Well, I think it is the next big thing in planning. I find it very interesting. I will undertake to, I have already read about it and kept up to date, and I will undertake to do so as we move forward and it comes into force next year. And I hope you will think of me if you ever need some legal advice. That's your part of the bargain for listening, for me telling you about this. Once I've finished delivering these slides, there will be chance for questions and answers. I am joined secretly by some colleagues who have other areas of expertise, since I did claim it would be everything you wanted to know about BNG, in case there are any questions in areas I don't have my own expertise in. So if you want to ask any questions, you can do so anytime using the Q&A button. If you have any technical questions, I won't be looking at the chat, but my colleagues will read any messages you put on there for any technical problems you might be having and see if they can help you. The event is being recorded, but it's just me, and if it turns out any of my colleagues speak later, then being recorded, and that will be sent out afterwards, as will the slides. Okay, well, let's get going. So I'm going to cover, not surprisingly, what Biodiversity Net Gain is, the timings, more of the detail. I think it is actually worth getting into the detail of how it works, and then an exploration of opportunities. Because I think not only are there challenges from BNG, but there are some significant opportunities for many people. So here we go. So what is it in very outline? Biodiversity net gain is a new concept that all planning permissions, that's planning permissions under town and country planning, and DCOs, that's development consents under the Planning Act 2008, will have to improve the environment by at least 10% compared with the situation before the development started, as a condition of getting permission, whether it's a planning permission or a DCO. This has come in through the Environment Act 2021, which got royal assent in November. It took rather a long time to get through Parliament, a couple of years, slow going, but it is finally enacted. And it is sections 98 and 99, one for town and country planning and one for DCOs, each of which is very short and just introduces a schedule later on in the Act, which gives all the detail, schedules 13 and 14. This is big. It will affect all but the smallest developments. A few very small ones are being exempted, but almost everything is going to be affected by this. And what I think is particularly interesting is that the government wants a market to be created for buying and selling biodiversity land. So this is a much bigger thing than just planning. The businesses will be created, and entrepreneurs will alight on this. The biggest landowners in the country may have huge potential for using their land productively. And so this is a much bigger issue than just simply planning permissions and DCOs. Timing. So as I said, the Environment Act was enacted in November 2021, but those two sections have not yet come into force. The government has launched a consultation, which when these slides come out, you can click on that link and you'll get to the consultation document. On all the detail, and the consultation closes on the 5th of April. they made a slight error and they said the 4th of April in the document, but they've changed it to the 5th of April. So everything I'm about to say is subject to change, because if everyone objects to it in the consultation, they might amend it. But I would say 80% of this will happen as planned, at least. The consultation document says they want Biodiversity Net Gain, BNG, to become law from 2 years after the Act was enacted, i.e. November next year. And for DCOs, are going to get another 2 years before they come in. And that is, in terms of planning applications, it's making the application after November, or with a particular day in November. And for DCOs, they're saying it should be that the DCO is accepted after it comes into force. I think that's slightly odd, and I think it'd be better if it was the DCO application was made after the date, but we'll see. That does seem a long way off, but it is already March 2022, and there are already local planning authority policies to provide BNG, even though it's not yet legal. You might have to look ahead. If you're buying some land that you're expecting to develop, you may not be putting the application in until November next year, in which case it will be caught by this. So you need to think about it now. And of course, this biodiversity unit market, early adopters may have an advantage if they make themselves known, just like I'm trying to do on the law. If they do it on buying and selling these units, it's worth doing now. The existing National Planning Policy Framework does already encourage biodiversity net gain, but it's not actually mandatory yet until this comes in. So let's get into the detail. Put a cold towel around your forehead and let's dive in. So there are a number of new concepts that I will briefly introduce. They're all the things in bold on this slide. So the way that the biodiversity BNG will be required is that every DCO and every planning permission will have to have a condition attached to it that there must be an approved biodiversity gain plan. When the DCO, it's called a requirement or on the condition, but it's actually the same thing. And that plan must commit to at least 10% improvement in biodiversity. So that's the plan that goes with the consent, but you will need to put some information about BNG in with the application that's slightly less detailed at the time of the application, and that's called biodiversity gain information. The next big concept is called the biodiversity metric, because you might wonder, what does 10% of biodiversity mean? How do you actually give a number to it? Well, the Natural England has produced this metric for measuring how much biodiversity land is worth. And I'm going to go into the detail of that because I think it is worth understanding. So the land affected by your development has a score. You then must achieve, assuming that land is going to be obliterated by your development, go down to 0. I suppose it might still have a small score. You will have to achieve on some other land that original score plus 10% of biodiversity value. It doesn't have to be on the same site or even adjacent to the same site or even in the same county. It could be miles away. But there are certain incentives to try and make it more local, as we will see. If you don't have your own land, you could develop land further away, or you could even pay someone else to do so with this idea of biodiversity units. So the biodiversity metric gives land a score in biodiversity units. So if you need 43 units, you can pay someone and they will have some land that will then be used to achieve that biodiversity net gain. This buying and selling of biodiversity net units will be recorded in a new national biodiversity gain site register. This is partly to make sure that the same land isn't counted more than once for the development it corresponds to, that it's offsetting. And I imagine that land will be able to put on this register that is as yet unallocated to any development. So you can go shopping by looking on this register and contact somebody to try and secure the land for your development. It may be, the government imagines initially that this market has not actually developed, taken off fully by November next year. So they're initially allowing you to just throw money at the problem and pay the government money in biodiversity credits until a market in biodiversity units is established. But that still will, behind the credits, will correspond to some land somewhere being improved, developed and protected for biodiversity net gain. Now the land, this 10% gain must be maintained for at least 30 years. The initial commitment must be for that long. The government, according to the consultation document, this period may get longer over time. So watch out for that. The final concept is additionality, that I think you need to know at the beginning. This is the sort of double counting concept. So is land that you're already setting aside for reason A, is that able to be used for biodiversity net gain as well? And the answer is slightly complicated. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And even when it's yes, the consultation document wants 10% of the land to be not used for anything else. It's quite complicated. It's towards the end of the consultation document. There's a section on additionality of what things they are thinking ought to not count at the same time, and things that you are permitted to count at the same time. So check that out if you've already got land that you've reserved for some reason. See whether you can use it again. Okay, the biodiversity metric. Now it's getting a bit mathematical, but I do think it's worth understanding how it works. A lot of descriptions of BNG that I've seen don't really go into this detail, so you don't really have a feel for what this 10% means. So there is a set of documents that Natural England have produced. There's a link there. There's a user guide that sets it all out. And how it is calculated is, it's the area of the land in hectares multiplied by the following three things. This is the current biodiversity value of the land you're going to develop. The first thing is called distinctiveness. So this is to do with the habitat of the land, what type of land it is. So if your land is divided into more than one habitat, you may need to split the land up for the calculation and then add the scores together. And according to the metric, land can score 0, 2, 4, 6 or 8. Hard standing is 0. And the mathematically minded of you may realize that if you multiply something by 0, you get 0. And if you add 10% to 0, you also get 0. So if you've got hard standing, you do not need to provide any biodiversity net gain because you're adding 10% to 0, which is still 0. However, most land will not be hard standing. Here's an example of each of the different other distinctivenesses. Grassland scores 2, mixed scrub scores 4, lowland fen scores 6, and something called blanket bog is the example of the highest type of habitat, which scores 8. Although I noticed that the consultation document refers to blanket bog as possibly irreplaceable habitat, so there's a slight conflict with the biodiversity metric there. But anyway, these things will be ironed out. The second thing you multiply your area by is the condition of the land, and that varies between 1 and 3. If it's in poor condition, it just stays at 1, you're multiplying by 1, so that doesn't make any difference. And if it's in good condition, you multiply it by 3 with a sliding scale getting between poor and good. The third thing you multiply your land by is called strategic significance, but that doesn't really make much difference because the highest it can be is 1.15, which is barely more than 1. But the three values it can have are if it's not in a plan, this is like the local development plan or something, it gets 1. If it is still not in a plan but is regarded as ecologically desirable, then it gets 1.1. And if it is earmarked in a plan as a sort of habitat that is worth preserving, it goes up to 1.15. So let's do an actual worked example to see what happens. Let's say we have a development that is going to affect 5 hectares of grassland that is in good condition and is not in a plan or is in a desirable area. So the area is 5. Grassland, if you remember, has a distinctiveness of 2. It being in good condition has a value of 3. And not being in a plan has a value of 1. So you multiply those 4 numbers together, 5 times 2 times 3 times 1, and you have 30 biodiversity units. So that is the score for the land that you are about to affect by your development. Since you must provide at least 10% biodiversity gain, that means that the after score that you're looking for somewhere has to be worth at least 33 units, that being 110% of 30. As I mentioned earlier, if it's got 0 distinctiveness, then you're in the clear because 10% of 0 is 0 and your score will be 0. So let's look at the after score, which is unfortunately even more complicated. So you do the same thing as the before score. You take the area in hectares, you multiply it by the distinctiveness, the condition, and the strategic significance. So those were the 3 same things as before, but you multiply them by 3 more things. And these are all less than 1, so they're all serving to reduce the score, which means you need more land to keep your score higher. The 3 things are difficulty of creation. So if it's easy to create, or indeed it's already created, that's 1, so that doesn't make any impact on the calculation. If it's medium difficulty, that's like 2/3, high 1/3, and very high difficulty 0.1. So you're going to need 10 times as much land if it's very difficult to create this habitat. And of course, you may notice that, of course, that implies it is not yet created, this habitat. You don't have to have created it in advance. But you obviously have to undertake to create it, and you will be checked that you are doing that. And that will all be part of the biodiversity gain plan. Here's another indication that it doesn't necessarily have to exist already, is a temporal score. So how long will it take to achieve the biodiversity score that you're seeking? There's a sliding scale. If it's already in the target condition, then that's 1, i.e. no change to your score. And then it gradually slides down to the surprising figure of 0.586 if it's going to take 30 years or no, more than 30 years to achieve. So any date after 30 years is all the same score. That's quite good. So that shows that this habitat could take quite a long time to achieve. And the final one, which gives an incentive for it being close to the development, is a spatial score. So you multiply your total by 1, i.e. no change, if the replacement land, BNG land, excuse me, is in the same local planning authority area. So that could be quite far away all the same. It doesn't have to be right next to your development. If you're in a big district, or if you're in a unitary authority like Cornwall, you can be developing Land's End and not have to, you could still provide BNG land just over the Tamar from Plymouth, and you'd be okay. If it's in the neighbouring local planning authority area, then that's 0.75 that you discount it by. And if it's beyond that, but anything beyond that, you halve the score, i.e. you multiply it by 0.5. So if your land is in Cornwall and your BNG land is in Northumberland, then you have to halve the score, i.e. you'll need to provide twice as much land. So let's work that through a bit. So if you remember our previous example, we had a calculation of 30 units. So we need to find 33 units to provide the BNG. So imagine we are going to create grassland, not in a desirable area. It'll take 2 years to reach that condition, and it'll be medium difficulty to do this. So you get your hectares. So we'll see how many hectares it is. Multiply that by 2 by 3 by 1 as before. Then our 3 discounts. Difficulty, it was medium difficulty, so that's 0.67. It'll take 2 years, which if you look up the table, it's not actually on my slide, is 0.931, and the location, well, we'll see what difference that makes. So if we're in the same local authority area, to get 33 hectares, hectares, to exceed 33 units, we will need 9 hectares, which would give 33.68. So remember, we were starting with 5 hectares. So we're going to need almost twice as much land, even in the same local authority area, because of that discount for difficulty and time. And if it was in the neighbouring local authority area, it would need 12 hectares, and if it's beyond that, you'll need 18 hectares. So that's getting on for 4 times as much land. So I hope going through all those scores does give you an appreciation of what we're up against here. By the way, I'm seeing some questions being asked in the chat. The chat, would you mind asking them in the Q&A if there are questions about my presentation? We're reserving the chat for technical questions about difficulty hearing me or you seeing the slides or something like that. So if you wouldn't mind copying them over into the Q&A, I'll look at that once I finish talking. So that's how the numbers work. Let us move on to 1 or 2 further considerations. So there are some rules in the Natural England metric document that sit on top of these numbers. So it is not a purely numbers game, but it nearly is. The most important rule that means it's not a purely numbers game is that you can't replace land of a higher distinctiveness with land of a lower distinctiveness. So if I just go back to distinctiveness, if you remember, that was 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8. So if you are losing some mixed scrub, that means you must replace it with at least mixed scrub or better. You can't replace it with grass. So that's quite a significant condition rule, because if you are building on some very highly protected land, you can't just create a massive amount of poorer quality land or poorer distinctiveness land. So that is the one I think is worth being aware of. The other ones are fairly sort of fairly common sense, really, if you like. In terms of habitat that is already there, or you're thinking of creating before the BNG actually comes into the law in November next year, there is this date of the 30th of January, 2 years ago now, that can, if it was developed since then, you can use it for biodiversity net gain. That is regarded as a gain. So you can get going now, in particular, with developing land, your grassland and your mixed scrub or your blanket bog. I don't know how long it takes to produce blanket bog, probably a long time. And you can then use that for either your own development, or you could sell it to somebody else for their development. Some habitat is so precious that it doesn't even have a distinctiveness score. It's sort of infinity, if you like. It is irreplaceable. I think ancient woodland is an example of that, because obviously being ancient woodland, it takes a long time to grow before it's ancient. So it's very difficult to replace that. So you'd have to look to different policies if you're affecting that, about how on top of the BNG you will be providing for other parts of your development, for how you're going to offset the loss of such habitat. As I say, there's a slight error that it gives blanket bog in the development, in the consultation document. It's an example of irreplaceable, but in the metric it gives it a score. So if you may have some of that habitat, or this will be an incentive to avoid it. As I mentioned, if you can't find land, your own, somebody else's, say you are affecting a reasonably high distinctiveness, then you can throw money at the problem and pay for biodiversity credits. But even behind those credits, there is some land that will be developed. It's not just, the government aren't just going to keep the money, one hopes. And finally, on these sort of further considerations, the government has said they're going to make biodiversity credits deliberately expensive so that the biodiversity unit market doesn't get affected by that and still created. So that's a warning. It would be better to buy some biodiversity units from someone rather than buy biodiversity credits from the government, because they're going to make sure that that doesn't interfere with you. I'm going to have a quick look at my questions that have been asked already, because there are quite a few. See if any relate to what I've said already. So somebody has said, just to note, there are a fair few different scores for grassland in the metric. Lowland calcareous grassland has a score of 6, as opposed to other lowland acid grassland is 4. So yes, do not take my word from that slide as to exactly what type of habitat you've got. Do look up the user guide to find out what its score is. Someone's asked about if you are offsetting with some other land, will there be a place where this information is held? Yes, there will be, this Biodiversity Net Gain register, which the government or Natural England or somebody will maintain. Somebody has asked, they're coming thick and fast here, will they be introduced into the Scottish planning system as well? I don't know the answer to that question, and this does only apply to England, this provision, that's worth mentioning. I think your BNG land also has to be in England for the moment. How proposed rewilding could be accommodated within the calculation of BNG? Well, I guess you would have to work out what habitat you are creating with your rewilding and look up the score of its distinctiveness in the metric. So it may not just be a case of just leaving land to do what it wants. You may want to purposely create a particular habitat. Small projects will be exempt. Yes, in the consultation document, there are some questions about what projects should be exempted. So it does give examples of projects that benefit from permitted development. Although I think that some of those are pretty big, and so maybe they shouldn't all be exempted from the provision of BNG, but we'll see. Householder extensions. It also mentions changes of use are likely to be exempted, which seems, I mean, is there any point in exempting them? If you're not actually doing anything to any land, you're just changing the use, then the score will be, you're not affecting any land, so the score will be 0, will it? Or will it? Maybe it won't be. So I can see why they're wanting to exempt that. So there is a section in the consultation document on what small projects will be exempt. Have a look at that. This is what the government is envisaging. Maybe if they get a whole host of responses saying, oh, please exempt these ones as well, they will extend that. Does the developer have to control the BNG land? It doesn't. No, the developer does not have to be control it itself, but there will have to be some legal mechanism that to ensure that whoever's land it is will maintain it, or if necessary, create it in the format, in the habitat required. I'll come on to that in a moment. That might be an occasion for my colleagues to jump in later. How are fields that are developed with solar panels treated? That's a good question, because solar projects do obviously take a lot of land, so they will have quite a high before score that needs to be offset. I presume if there's grass under them, then and that stays as grass, then that can be used in the after score and will help reduce the new amount that is needed. But this seminar is obviously no substitute for actual legal advice on these things. Pay me and I'll tell you. Yeah. Interested in understanding what the requirements for permissive development? Yes, permissive development they are proposing will be exempt from BNG because it's not really controlled under there being an application. So, but check both the consultation document and the results of the consultation, because that may change. If you have a linear project, I've got to keep an eye on the time. I'm getting asked quite a lot of questions here. Because I'm going to finish at 11. I know you've got days to get on with. So I'll answer a couple more and then plough through the rest of my slides and then answer as many as I can up to 10 o'clock. It was like me worrying that nobody would ask any questions. Right, if you have a linear project, whereas there's temporary disturbance to land, there's another question about temporary developments. I think that is treated in the consultation documents. There is mention of temporary developments, but some temporary developments are obviously quite long running, and you may still need to provide BNG. Yes, long linear projects are quite difficult to work out. There is a special part of the metric for calculating things like hedgerows and linear biodiversity land. I would need to check whether there is also something for linear projects. What are the potential capital tax implications? That's definitely, okay. Right, these are getting quite technical. I'm going to move on to finish my slides and then I'll sweep up as many questions as I can. For ones that I don't manage to answer online, I and my colleagues will write some answers and we will circulate them to all those who attended or registered to attend. So don't worry if your question didn't get answered in the time. Right, I just want to give an example of, or a feel for how this is a big thing. So in 2019, there were nearly 400,000 planning applications decided in England. So introduction of BNG is a challenge for many of the developers of those planning applications, but an opportunity for others and for other landowners. I mean, this is, so that just shows the scale of what we're talking about, because most of those 400,000 planning applications wouldn't have provided any biodiversity gain. They just have built on some land. It would have lost biodiversity value. that's it. So they resulted in loss, never mind offsetting to zero the biodiversity loss. And now we'll not only have to recoup any loss, but add 10% on top. So that is quite significant and will affect, if you add up all the footprint of all those planning applications and regard all those discounts that the calculation requires, which means that more land will be required, that is going to be a huge amount of land is going to have to be earmarked for BNG. I think there will be quite a difference between developments in urban areas and rural areas, because rural areas, being rural, will have available land on site or adjacent for BNG, where urban areas will be much more difficult. And of course, most developments are in urban areas. This is going to affect the market for buying and selling land for development, because developers are going to want not to have to pay for this extra cost and that to be reflected in the price of the land. So there are huge consequences for all this. That this is only the tip of the iceberg of how it's going to work. This is just my colleagues' slight brainstorm. There is a sort of general schism as to how BNG is going to work for if you're a developer and if you're a landowner. So if you're a developer, it's generally a challenge, and if you're a landowner, generally it's an opportunity. So here are some particular considerations that my colleagues have assisted me with in when it comes to if you're a developer. So you might need to be thinking now, because if you're applying for planning permission after November 2023, because you will be caught by BNG, and you will also need to look at your local planning authorities' policies, because they may have a higher figure. I believe the city of Cambridge has introduced a 20% figure, for example, or is in the process of doing so. So when you're selecting the site for your development, you should definitely factor BNG into that choice, because how you can deliver it may affect your choice of, or may affect the score, or may affect the amount you need to provide somewhere else, depending on the habitat affected. And its location. There may be some adjacent land that could be developed, which would be easy. Or you may have to get these biodiversity units off somebody, or you may have to pay the government for expensive credits. Certainly initially, councils will be enforcing BNG through through the fact that it might be a breach of condition not to comply with the biodiversity gain plan, or it might be a breach of a Section 106 agreement if it's been captured in that. Or there is this new concept that is introduced in the Environment Act called a conservation covenant. So this is a sort of charge, and in fact it is recorded in the local land charges register that land is to be kept in a certain state as a conservation covenant. So that's another way that BNG land may be secured if it's put on that register. And councils certainly initially are going to be very keen to make sure this all works, and are going to be looking at the obligations and how the land is secured very closely. So the contract, if you're buying some land to develop, you will have to think about how to write into that contract all the uncertainties if you have not yet secured off-site land, or the landowner could have done it themselves. You won't know exactly the cost of having to provide BNG, and you may have to control activities on the land, on your own, on the developed land or the BNG land, or all sorts of things. So the land contract is going to get rather more complicated. Then on the other side, the landowner considerations. I think this is a significant. If you just have some land sitting around, not doing very much, this is a significant opportunity to make some money out of it, and to do good, because you're going to make it more biodiverse. You need, so this is when selling land, this is an opportunity to maximize its value, and when keeping land that you're not selling, you can increase, you can use it much more productively. Finally, as I said, what's in it for you? I've thought of some opportunities. There's a vast selection of those who have signed up to attend this, of different jobs that they have. There is some government research it might be worth looking at that accompanies the consultation that suggests that one biodiversity unit could be worth anything between £4,000 and £100,000. You'd wonder why on earth would anyone be interested in one of those higher value ones, because everyone's going to buy the cheapest. But remember that distinctiveness thing that you can't have you can't replace with a lower distinctiveness. So you may have to buy one of the more expensive units if it's a higher distinctiveness. So we're talking quite big money here. Remember that my little 5-hectare development was had a score of 30, needed 33. So even at the lowest score, that's 4 times 33, which I do in my head is £132,000. If you are doing a development and you have either developing your own BMG or off-site, on-site or off-site, and the development exceeds the 10% you need, say you had that 30 unit development and you need 33, but say you've got your land you've secured is going to produce 40 units, then you've got a spare 7. So you could put that on the biodiversity gain register or sell it to somebody, which will help offset the cost of your development. But obviously you will need to keep it in the distinctive, or develop it into the distinctiveness you have promised, and keep it in that condition for 30 years. Some of the metric is subjective. So the condition of the land, the difficulty in creating the new habitat, the time it will take. So I think if you are an environmental consultant, your advice may be required. In fact, that your advice may be evidence of the score of the new habitat, about how long it's going to take and all that sort of thing. So there's an opportunity for you. It is definitely, this market is going, even though the government may reduce some of the applications that are affected eventually, trim it at the bottom end, this is still going to be something that is definitely going to come in, and it's going to be very big. So it's worth finding and preparing land to offset, either for a development you have in mind, or just for anyone to use. Obviously, the higher distinctiveness you manage to develop the land into, the more valuable and the more different developments it will be able to be used for. So that's something to bear in mind. Incidentally, I noticed there are some people signed up from companies such as National Highways and Network Rail, who have huge landed estates themselves. There is a special section in the consultation document about how you might be able to do a sort of group biodiversity land on your estate to cater for several developments at once and that sort of thing. So that's worth looking at. If you're a lawyer, it will definitely require additional legal instruments or additional clauses in existing instruments to secure the land, in particular, to prove that it is secured and will provide this BMG for the requisite time. If you're in business or you want to go into business, here is an opportunity to create, buy and sell biodiversity units. The government will, even though these credits are just, as far as you're concerned, you just give them some money, you don't know where the land is going to be. Underlying that, there will be some land that will have to be developed, so the government will need somebody to develop that land, so they're worth approaching. The consultation, incidentally, is under the auspices of DEFRA rather than DLUC. for the new planning, where planning resides currently. And charities often own land, or which they may wish to develop for charitable. They may have environmental charitable purposes. That really is straying out of my comfort zone, but there's a potential opportunity there. So I think there's something for everyone here. It is quite exciting, if a lawyer is allowed to be excited. And it is definitely worth investing time and effort into understanding and looking for opportunities, I would say. So I will go through as many Q&A as I can. I think my colleagues are probably excused that they won't need to say anything because there are so many questions. There's 38 unanswered questions already. Just briefly and finally, in terms of my presentation, next steps. So as I said, there's this consultation to which you can respond anytime up to the 5th of April, so it's less than a month away now. It is very detailed. It's like 70 pages or something. And there's a lot of detail in there that this presentation could only scratch the surface of, but I hope I've given you a flavour of it and the basics of how this is all going to work. So it's worth reading the consultation document and even responding to the consultation if you don't like something that's proposed or you have some good idea. We will be providing further events on our own, and we're also developing some events with other organisations. So watch this space, we will advertise them. I hope we can use the, if it doesn't breach data protection, we can use the list of people who've signed up for this event to advertise further events in the same field. If you would like us to do an event for you, for your organisation specifically, we'd be very happy to do that. Just get in touch with me or my event colleagues. And the consultation will eventually lead to regulations, which will provide the actual legal flesh on the bones. So I undertake to keep myself informed of all developments in this area. So you can always ask if you have a question, and I will have further events like this where I will provide further information as this develops and we get to D-Day or B-Day in November next year. Right, that is the end of my presentation. I have 10 minutes. My colleague Tristan has asked if he can say a word before I launch into as many of your questions as I can. So yes, please do, Tristan.
That's kind, Angus. I hope I'm now visible and audible. I was really thinking about the answer to the questions. So do you want me to look at some of those where the landowner's perspective has been raised?
Please do.
First one from Patrick Beddoes. Hello, Patrick. Haven't seen you for ages. I think that your question is about tenancies and can landowners, can freehold owners be caught under tenancies? I think that's pretty unlikely given the 30-year period. A sensible planning authority and a sensible regulator will want to see that the land is available to the landowner for the whole period. And as we know, 30-year tenancies are not even in the best of worlds are not secure, including 86 Act tenancies. Somebody has asked about capital taxes and the reliefs. The consultation paper specifically mentions those, agricultural property relief and business property relief. So we can expect some guidance from government about that. My own view is that if nothing changes, we are unlikely to have agricultural property relief available, but business property relief may be available, provided the landowner who's providing the credits can demonstrate that they are carrying out a business. Now that may be, of course, that brings into the question of, are landowners going to get paid on a regular basis for making and maintaining these sites, or is it a one-off payment whereby you create the biodiversity and that's the end of it? There was a question about solar farms. Interestingly, I'm acting for a landowner on the grant of a lease for one of those right now. And to pick up Angus's point, the developer has not raised this question at all. So I suspect they will be dipping their hands into their pocket somewhere down the line to buy the biodiversity credits if they are necessary. My own view is that creating a solar farm will damage the biodiversity, so there will be a degrade. And in any event, you've got to increase. So biodiversity credits would be used there. Somebody has asked about the, is there a risk of reduction of unscrupulous people damaging their land so as to lower the threshold? That's been picked up in the consultation. Local authorities in the planning process will be asked to look for evidence of biodegradation back to 2020. I mean, that's probably enough from me for the moment.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything.
Thank you very much, Tristan. Yes, a bit like if you know about compulsory purchase, you can't do things deliberately to increase the compensation you might receive. Similarly, you can't deliberately degrade your land so that the before score is lower. That will not be taken into account. They've thought of that. Right, well, we've now had 51 questions. So we've only got 5 minutes left. I will answer a couple, but just to say generally, the number of people that have been interested in signing up for this seminar and the number of questions everyone has shows that there is a great thirst for knowledge, which is very good, because this is a huge new thing that will affect everyone. And it's very good to get yourselves up to speed now, because it's already having an effect on developments and land. So, as I said, we will capture all the questions you've asked. We will answer them in writing to all the attendees. You will also get a copy of the slides and a recording of me, if you can bear my voice for yet another hour. And we will keep in touch with further events. So I've got 5 minutes. Let's see how many I can get through. Does the developer have to control the land, the BNG land, by owning the freeholder? Could a lease be sufficient? It's essentially, the answer is, as long as the land will be demonstrably secure for providing the BNG, it doesn't matter who owns it or anything like that, but it will have to be secured in a contract or in something. Section 106 or this conservation covenant, or there are various mechanisms that are still quite under development. Can I ask if you have a linear project? I think I've answered that one already. Temporary developments I've answered. Should you as a, well, I haven't really answered, but I tried to answer. Should you as a landowner offer land for BNG to a developer and manage it on their behalf? What you believe are implications? I think Tristan answered that one. Do you know the cost of the credits? No, I don't. That doesn't exist yet. But given that the value of a unit is between £4,000 and £100,000, according to the market research that the government commissioned, and they say it will be deliberately expensive to so as not to interfere with the creation of this market in units, I would guess it would be at least twice as much as that. So you're looking at £8,000 for a unit, but obviously there's a lot of time between now and these credits coming into force, so that is an extremely vague number. If you're in land and have voluntarily improved biodiversity since the 30th of January 2020 and are looking to redevelop, what will represent the baseline at the point of redevelopment? That is a good question. It's like the other side of the coin of, did you degrade land deliberately to try and get a low score? What happens if you improved it? It seems a bit unfair that you should therefore have to provide even more just because you were environmentally responsible. I'm going to have to think about that one and answer in writing. Will the scheme apply to those rail schemes that don't need planning consents? If it's permitted development, the current intention is it will not be caught by BNG, if that's what you mean. Who will police the delivery of biodiversity that is bought through credits? Well, the developer shouldn't have to worry about that. That will be up to the government to do it internally. And whether it polices itself is is going to be interesting. But one would imagine that they will have contracts with landowners who have undertaken to preserve the land or create it or whatever. That's quite interesting. What's under the bonnet of biodiversity credits is a whole topic in itself. Right, one more question. How will sites that benefit from permitted developments be affected, e.g. ports and airports? As I say, in the consultation document, the intention is permitted development will not, BNG will not be caught by permitted development. But I think some of these developments are pretty significant in environmental terms. Although if they need an environmental statement, that means they don't benefit from permitted development. But they can still be quite large, so we'll see what happens at the end of the consultation. Right, I think that is all we have time for. I really appreciate you spending an hour listening to me. I hope that was useful and you now feel you have a basic grounding in BNG. But obviously there's a lot of detail to come and we will make sure we are at the forefront of learning about it, advising on it, and hopefully you will be with us on this journey. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and we will be in touch with you. Thanks for joining.